Haditha Massacre. On the morning of November 19, 2005, in the Iraqi town of Haditha, a roadside bomb tore through a U.S. Marine convoy. The explosion killed a Marine instantly and left 2 other Marines badly wounded. Within hours, that turned into one of the darkest chapters of the Iraq War. The Marines shot 5 unarmed men who had been ordered out of their taxi, killing them on the spot. Then, they entered nearby houses. Inside were families with grandparents, parents, and children as young as 1 year old. Nonetheless, 19 civilians were killed in their homes, most shot at close range in the chest or head. By the end of the day, 25 unarmed civilians were dead, with the youngest victim being just 3 years old. The Marine Corps' first official story was false. They claimed that 15 civilians had been killed by the roadside bomb, and that 8 insurgents died in a firefight afterward. However, an Iraqi human rights worker filmed the aftermath: bullet holes in walls, bloodstains on floors, and bodies of women and children with gunshot wounds. A Time magazine reporter then began investigating and found that doctors at the local hospital confirmed that none of the bodies showed bomb injuries, but close-range gunshot wounds. A 9-year-old girl who survived said she saw her grandfather shot first in the chest and then in the head, followed by her grandmother. Investigations stretched on for years, and at first, 8 Marines were charged, but case after case collapsed. Some Marines received immunity in exchange for testimony, while others had their charges dropped. By 2008, nearly all charges were gone, and the only Marine punished was Vuteric. He admitted to negligent dereliction of duty, lost rank and pay, but avoided jail. For many Iraqis, this outcome was unbearable, as families who had lost multiple relatives in one morning saw 6 years of U.S. military prosecution end without a single Marine imprisoned. Survivors called it an assault on humanity. Lawyers for the victims urged international courts to take up the case. Meanwhile, the U.S. military paid $38,000 in compensation to some families. Samar Campaign. Kill everyone over the age of 10. Those were the words of General Jacob H. Smith during the Philippine-American War in what became known as the Pacification of Samar. His order did not apply only to armed enemy fighters, but to everyone, as he wanted to turn the island into, in his own words, a howling wilderness. The situation leading up to this was already tense, as just months earlier, Filipino fighters together with local townspeople had carried out the Balangiga massacre, where in a surprise attack, they killed 54 and wounded 18 U.S. soldiers. That's when the U.S. government sent General Smith to Samar, who made it clear that he wanted no prisoners and asked for everyone capable of bearing arms to be killed. When Marines asked him what exactly capable of bearing arms meant, Smith explained that it meant boys as young as 10 years old. Waller himself, the major leading these Marines, partly resisted these instructions, telling some of his officers not to target women and children. Still, over just 11 days, he reported that his men burned 255 homes and killed 39 people. Civilians saw their towns and food reduced to ashes. The number of deaths will never be fully known, but broader estimates suggest around 2,000 to 2,500 civilians were killed. The campaign became infamous in the United States once reports reached home, and Smith was put on trial in May 1902, but not for murder or war crimes. Instead, he was found guilty only of conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline, a minor charge. His punishment was just a formal reprimand. To calm public anger, he was quietly forced into retirement. Waller himself was also later put on trial for ordering the execution of Filipino porters, but he was acquitted. This was one of the most brutal and controversial U.S. campaigns of the Vietnam War. You can get an idea of what really happened when you hear that the Army reported about 11,000 enemy killed, but recovered only 750 weapons from the dead. Operation Speedy Express, carried out from December 1968 to May 1969, and run under Major General Julian Ewell, had the official goal of destroying Viet Cong bases, cutting supply lines, and re-establishing U.S. control over a region considered a stronghold of the Viet Cong, the Mekong Delta. On paper, the operation looked like an overwhelming success, considering that just 242 American soldiers died, while the enemy lost 11,000. With a ratio of 45-1, it looked like a decisive victory, but the numbers hid something darker. The fact that only about 750 weapons were recovered means that thousands of those killed were probably unarmed civilians. The Army's own Inspector General later estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 civilians were killed during the operation. The campaign relied on overwhelming firepower, like helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, and fighter bomber strikes, in a heavily crowded region with civilians. This basically turned entire areas into free fire zones, David Hackworth, a highly decorated battalion commander, admitted openly, "A lot of innocent Vietnamese civilians got slaughtered because of the Yule hunt drive to have the highest body count in the land." Survivors and witnesses described whole villages wiped out, with civilians getting shot from the air as they tried to run. A Viet Cong commander later explained, "Most of the people killed were civilians, because civilians would run. We soldiers held our positions." Reports of atrocities began to surface in 1969, but they were overshadowed by the My Lai massacre, which we've just talked about. In 1972, Newsweek published an investigation by Kevin Buckley and Alexander Shimkin called Pacification's Deadly Price. They had interviewed villagers and studied hospital records. In one provincial hospital, they found that 3/4 of the civilian wounds treated came from US firepower, not Viet Cong attacks. Their conclusion was that thousands of civilians had been killed during Speedy Express. Mysore Square Massacre. This one was different from the others. It happened without warning, and not by the regular US Army, but by a private contractor known as Blackwater, which made it even more controversial. On a normal morning in September 2007, a Blackwater convoy drove into Mysore Square in Baghdad to clear a route for US officials. Moments later, though, out of nowhere, they opened fire on Iraqi civilians. 17 people were killed, and 20 more were wounded. Some were shot while still sitting in their cars. For example, witnesses described one small Kia with a mother and her adult son inside. The son was shot in the head, and the car kept moving forward and was riddled with more bullets before a grenade set it on fire. Blackwater claimed the convoy had been ambushed and that the guards fired in self-defense, but the Iraqi government called it an unprovoked attack. The State Department admitted that innocent people had been killed, and Iraq suspended Blackwater's license to operate in its territory and demanded accountability. Several investigations began, and a US military report supported Iraq's version of events, saying Blackwater was at fault. The FBI concluded that at least 14 of the 17 people killed had been shot without justification. Some Blackwater guards themselves told investigators that the shooting was wrong. One guard even kept firing after others shouted for him to stop, until another contractor aimed his weapon at him to force him to stand down. The massacre raised questions about the role of private military contractors, and Iraq demanded punishment for Blackwater and pressed for compensation. In the US, the House passed a bill to bring contractors under US criminal law in war zones, though the Senate did not vote on it. Then, the State Department told Blackwater its security contract would not be renewed, and years later, the case reached US courts. In 2014, 4 Blackwater guards were convicted in federal court. One of them was sentenced to life in prison, while the others received 30 years each under firearms laws. There were some appeals, but in the end, the man originally sentenced to life was once again given life in prison, while the other 3 had their sentences reduced to about half of what they were before. Later on, however, there was a final twist. In December 2020, President Donald Trump pardoned all 4 men. The decision triggered outrage in Iraq and harsh criticism from United Nations experts, who said the pardons violated US obligations under international law. Abu Ghraib. The photos from Abu Ghraib are widely known around the world for how disturbing they look, but the background is even darker. To the public, Abu Ghraib was a normal detention and interrogation facility, but it wasn't at all. Inside, there was sexual humiliation to lengths we can't go to for obvious reasons: torture, physical abuse, and rape. There was even the killing of Manadel al-Jamadi, whose body was packed in ice and later photographed with soldiers posing beside it. The shock was immediate and worldwide, so the Bush administration answered quickly, saying that these were isolated acts by a few rogue soldiers. However, organizations like the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch said the opposite, claiming this was part of a larger pattern across US prisons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. The Red Cross also reported that most Abu Ghraib detainees were civilians with no connection to armed groups. Then, internal documents showed how they were given approval for what were called enhanced interrogation techniques. These documents would be later known as the torture memos, for reasons you can imagine. They argued that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply overseas and didn't classify the detainees as prisoners of war, which allowed them to hold people longer without charges and deny them the rights normally given to prisoners of war. Other orders showed Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez authorizing the use of dogs, extreme heat and cold, reversed sleep cycles, and sensory deprivation. Inside the cells, prisoners were stripped naked and forced into humiliating poses, threatened with dogs, beaten, shackled in painful positions, deprived of sleep and warmth, and forced into sexual acts. Taguba recorded one prisoner sodomized with a chemical light. Detainees spoke of acid poured on their skin, being dragged by ropes tied to their genitals, and being mocked. Manadel al-Jamadi whose death was ruled a homicide, never led to any criminal charges. At the same time, 36 detainees died in insurgent mortar attacks on the prison, which critics said violated the Geneva rule that prisoners should not be kept in active combat zones. In 2006, the Supreme Court ruled that the Geneva Conventions did apply, and 17 soldiers and officers were removed, while 11 were court-martialed. The punishments varied. One guy got 10 years, some 3, and others shorter sentences, or even just reprimands or demotions. External contractors, such as the company CACI Premier Technology, also came under scrutiny. Pretty recently, in 2024, a jury found them liable for conspiring with military police to soften up prisoners through abuse, awarding 3 former detainees $42 million in damages. Jurors concluded that CACI interrogators facilitated mistreatment even if they did not personally carry it out. Operation Speedy Express. My Lai Massacre. On the 16th of March 1968, in the Vietnamese village called Sun Mai, U.S. soldiers carried out what became the largest massacre of civilians by American forces in the 20th century. Between 347 and 504 unarmed villagers, most of them women, children, and the elderly, were killed. Many women and girls, some as young as 12, were raped before being murdered. Bodies were mutilated, homes were burned, and livestock was slaughtered. Witnesses described women using their bodies to shield children, only for soldiers to fire into them. One ditch alone held more than 70 dead. Then, platoons went hut to hut, killing entire families, bayoneting the wounded, and throwing grenades. Soldiers later testified that their orders had been to destroy everything, leave nothing, and treat anyone still there as the enemy. One soldier intentionally shot himself in the foot to avoid taking part. A few, like Michael Bernhardt, refused to kill and later helped expose what happened. The massacre might have been even worse if not for Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. and his helicopter crew. Flying low over the village, they saw women and children being slaughtered, and at one point, Thompson landed between U.S. soldiers and terrified civilians, ordering his own gunners to fire on Americans if they kept killing. He personally evacuated survivors by helicopter, saving dozens. At first, the massacre was reported as a great victory, claiming that 128 Viet Cong were killed, and the unit was congratulated. Officers up the chain of command worked to hide the truth, but later on, when veterans like Ronald Reidenhauer spoke out and journalist Seymour Hersh investigated, the world learned the real story. When photographs surfaced showing women, children, and babies piled in ditches, what happened could no longer be denied. In the end, 26 soldiers were charged, but only one, Lieutenant Calley, was convicted. He was found guilty of murdering 22 villagers and sentenced to life in prison, but he served 3.5 years under house arrest after President Nixon intervened. Medina, accused of giving the orders, was acquitted. Most others escaped punishment. Survivors, many of them children at the time, carried the trauma for decades. One recalled, "Everyone in my family was killed. They threw me into a ditch full of dead bodies. I was covered with blood and brains."